She wasn't loud. She didn't protest. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. And yet, within minutes, two security guards were walking toward her like she'd set off an alarm no one else could hear. At Cleargate Airport's exclusive first-class boarding zone, where suits gleamed and watches whispered six-figure paychecks, a black woman in a simple gray sweater stood alone, her posture straight, her eyes calm, a phone in one hand, a navy blue suitcase in the other. That was all it took, an employee whispered. A manager raised an eyebrow. A button was pressed. Moments later, the woman was escorted away in front of silent onlookers who pretended not to see. No one offered help. No one questioned it. But what they didn't know, what not even security knew, was that this woman held the fate of their entire airline in her hands. And the second she reached for her phone, the balance of power shifted without a sound. This isn't just a story of race. It's a story of silence, of systems, and of a reckoning that began with a smile and ended with a $4 billion fallout. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Elena Moore stood in the VIP priority line, unnoticed by the system, but hyper-visible to its gatekeepers. She was dressed with intention: soft gray turtleneck, clean slacks, low leather shoes, no logos, no noise. Her hair pulled into a neat bun. Her suitcase didn't scream luxury. It whispered function. Nothing about her declared wealth, and for that very reason, she was treated as if she had none. The Cleargate Airport terminal thrived on appearances. The subtle scent of leather briefcases, designer perfume, and whispered status codes permeated the air. Passengers scrolled through the newest smartphones, their expressions polished with generational confidence. Elena, standing silently in their midst, might as well have been invisible until she became too visible. A senior aviation supervisor named Patricia Wexler was stationed at the security counter, wearing a stiff navy blazer pulled tight around her body like armor. Her eyes scanned the line, pausing, lingering on Elena. There was no outburst, no disruption, just a quiet flick of Patricia's walkie-talkie button and a sentence delivered with clinical detachment. Delta 7, check the subject at the end of the priority line. Possible entry into the wrong zone. A few passengers shifted slightly, sensing tension, but not enough to interfere. Elena hadn't moved. She had only stepped forward with her e-ticket displayed on her phone, clearly marked First Class, Zone 1. Still, Patricia barely glanced at it, without scanning, without asking questions. "You may be in the wrong line. Economy is over there," she said. No smile, no courtesy, just dismissal. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't correct her posture or lower her gaze. She met Patricia's eyes directly, evenly. "I know exactly where I'm standing," she said. A standoff, silent but razor-edged. Patricia smiled, not kindly but like someone preparing to strike beneath the surface. Then came the nod, barely perceptible, to a nearby employee. Another silent cue. The message was clear. "Get her out." Before Elena could even move, a young staff member approached, attempting to guide her away with gentle hands and a forced smile. Still, Elena didn't resist. She simply stood. Then Patricia whispered, not loud but loud enough for nearby staff to hear. "Another reward point upgrade. Thinks having a seat means sitting next to someone who actually belongs here." The line didn't react, not visibly, but the humiliation hung in the air like static. Elena heard it, and yet she didn't react. She didn't show anger, didn't produce a badge or business card, didn't explain herself. She didn't have to. Her silence was her strategy. Two uniformed officers appeared shortly after, moving through the terminal with the relaxed aggression of people who knew the odds were on their side. They approached Elena with clipped politeness. "Ma'am, will you come with us for a quick check?" There was no cause, no violation, no suspicion other than presence. She nodded. Inside the security room, a sterile box with humming fluorescent lights and cold walls, Elena answered each question with clarity and precision. "Full name?" "Elena Moore." "Purpose of travel?" "To conduct an internal review of a strategic partner." The male officer frowned. "If it's business, why are you dressed so plainly?" It was the question behind every look she'd received that day. spoken out loud. Elena blinked once, then calmly replied, "Are you asking if my clothing makes me unqualified?" The officer said nothing. Another guard began rifling through her fabric tote bag, finding only a laptop, a journal, and a sealed envelope with a crimson wax emblem marked Adverlink Group. "What's this?" the guard asked. "Work documents." "May we open it?" Elena's voice didn't rise, but her words landed like stone. "If you want to read that, you'll need a lawyer and a court order." That was when the tone in the room shifted. The guard froze. Elena zipped the bag slowly, deliberately, and said, "If this is a random check, please log it accordingly. But if this was requested by someone specific, I want the reason in writing." Back in the surveillance room, Patricia Wexler sat reclined in her chair, one hand in a bag of snacks, watching the screen. She smiled, not because of procedure, because this was the performance she lived for, the slow, careful degradation of those she decided didn't fit. What Patricia didn't know was that her favorite screen wasn't the only one recording. A secondary security system, non-networked, internal only, had logged every gesture, every glance, every whisper. And Elena wasn't just documenting the humiliation. She was watching the machine behind it. 20 minutes passed, no violations, no findings. Elena was released. She didn't storm out. She didn't look back. She simply walked, composed, upright, carrying the full weight of their doubt on her shoulders like a tailored shawl. At the gate, Patricia didn't meet her eyes. The scanner beeped green. Seat 1C or first class. And Elena knew. The game had just begun. As Elena stepped into the cool, perfumed cabin of first class, her presence felt like a tremor. Subtle, but undeniable. Seat 1C was hers, not just on paper, not just by boarding pass, but by position, earned, authorized, unshakable. And yet not a single person welcomed her. The man in 1A, a polished executive in his 50s, glanced sideways as she stowed her carry-on. His tailored suit whispered affluence. His silence screamed entitlement. He didn't move to make space, didn't offer a smile, but his eyes spoke loudly. "You don't belong here." Elena ignored it. She lowered herself gently into her seat, spine straight, hands folded neatly. The cabin crew bustled around with warm towels, champagne, and faint scripted kindness, but none of it made it to her tray. Chief Flight Attendant Kelly Wexler approached, her features eerily reminiscent of Patricia's. Same sharp eyes, same forced poise. As she served row 1, her pace faltered. Her hand hesitated over Elena's tray. Then, with barely a blink, she walked past. No towel, no drink, not even a nod. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Still, Elena didn't speak. But she remembered. She remembered because silence was a language she'd learned to read fluently, a language used not in words but in absences. And in those absences, system spoke the loudest. The man in 1A cleared his throat and muttered, "Guess nowadays anyone with money can squeeze into this world." It wasn't meant to be heard, but it was meant to be felt. Elena turned to him, eyes calm. "You think money's all it takes to sit here?" He blinked. "If it were that easy," she continued softly, "do you think I'd still need money to get here?" He didn't reply. And that was the point. Outside the aircraft, the weight of Elena's identity stretched far beyond the seating chart. What no one in that cabin knew, not Patricia, not Kelly, not the man in 1A, was that Elena Moore wasn't just a passenger. She was the senior internal audit specialist at Adverlink Group, a name that didn't appear in press releases but defined which airlines lived or died. 3 weeks ago, Elena had been selected by Adverlink's Board of Mergers and Strategic Affairs to conduct a Level 3 covert audit of Grand Sky Airlines, their proposed $3.8 billion merger with a failing international carrier hinged on a single report, hers. And she hadn't come to review numbers. She had come to test character. In boardrooms and on balance sheets, companies looked the same. But in boarding gates, priority lanes, and quiet corners of customer service, the truth revealed itself. Culture couldn't be faked under pressure. Elena's entire itinerary had been pre-approved, booked through an internal-only backend of Adverlink's system, marked with invisible codes known only to senior staff. Her ticket bore the executive command watermark. Her name was registered in internal logs as the final checkpoint of approval before merger funding could proceed. But none of that mattered at the gate, because all Patricia saw was a woman in a gray sweater. All Kelly saw was someone easy to skip. And now, as the aircraft doors sealed and the final passenger settled, something shifted. Kelly returned, expression stiff. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, tone flat. "We need to ask you to move to the back row. There's been a last-minute adjustment to the front cabin's weight distribution." Elena didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply asked, "Am I heavier than everyone else in this cabin?" Kelly's eyes narrowed. "This isn't personal. It's a safety protocol." Elena nodded slowly. "And I'm following internal procedure as well." She reached calmly into her tote bag, pulled out her phone, and opened a secure AdverLink auditing app. A blue icon blinked. She typed a single line. "Trial complete. Submit file code to corporate, then press send." Kelly watched her, confused. Elena placed her phone on her tray and said without raising her voice, "If this airline truly has a weight problem, maybe it's not the passengers who need relocating." The words landed heavier than any turbulence. Kelly froze. Behind her, the entire cabin stilled. Glasses paused. Eyes darted. No one knew exactly what had just happened, but they knew it mattered. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, at AdverLink Group headquarters, a system decrypted the incoming signal. Level 3 field trial, complete. Airline Grand Sky. Result, failure. Action, initiate emergency review. Suspend pending financial support. Inside the aircraft, Elena resumed her silence. But the turbulence wasn't in the air. It was inside the structure of a company that had just exposed itself, fully and without realizing, to the one person who could dismantle it with a signature. 3 hours later, the plane touched down in Seattle. Passengers gathered their belongings, still blissfully unaware of the storm they'd just flown through. Elena Moore remained seated, eyes fixed ahead, waiting, because she knew it wasn't over yet, and it wasn't. As the cabin doors opened, a uniformed crew member approached her seat and leaned in. "Ms. Moore, please come with us. There's a security issue that needs clarification." No handcuffs, no raised voices, just polite coercion cloaked in protocol. Elena stood. She followed them down a quiet corridor, through a service elevator, and into a dimly lit conference room. Inside sat 4 people: the head of airport security, a representative from Grand Sky Airlines, FAA observer Jordan Keller, and, unsurprisingly, Kelly Wexler. A printed document lay on the table stamped urgent. Subject, passenger Elena Moore. Charge, disruptive behavior and non-compliance following safety directive. They were preparing to bury her under the weight of bureaucratic accusation, a defensive reflex, automatic, mechanical. But the system had made one fatal mistake. It had assumed Elena Moore was alone. She took her seat with grace, placed her handbag on the table, and withdrew a white envelope sealed in crimson wax. The tri-branch emblem of AdverLink Group shimmered under the overhead light. She opened it slowly, removed a single page. Then she began to read. Elena Moore, Senior Internal Audit Specialist, authorized by the Board of Mergers and Strategic Affairs, AdverLink Group. This report comprises a covert Level 3 customer experience audit of Grand Sky Airlines. Audit Code 998-X. Scope, discriminatory conduct at mid to senior personnel levels. Silence. The Grand Sky rep turned gray. Kelly blinked 3 times in rapid succession. The FAA observer straightened in his chair. Only the head of security dared to speak. "Ms. Moore, we sincerely apologize if—" Elena raised her hand, palm open. "I'm not here for apologies," she said. "I'm here to see if your system is brave enough to look itself in the mirror." She reached for her phone, tapped an icon, and turned the screen to face the room. A video played, security footage, captured by an off-network camera, silent but painfully clear. Patricia Wexler at the gate, her whispered insult, Kelly's silent exclusion, the seat reassignment. The moment Elena submitted the audit report mid-flight, everything recorded, unedited, undeniable. No one spoke. Because now the room wasn't evaluating her. It was evaluating itself. The FAA observer nodded and jotted a note. The Grand Sky representative wiped sweat from his brow. Kelly simply stared, her expression blank, but her career already evaporating. The walls of civility trembled. For too long, Grand Sky Airlines had coasted on the illusion of excellence. Diversity brochures, community partnerships, a polished website with staged stock photos. But inside, disproportionate complaints from passengers of color, 85% of first-class flight attendants promoted through informal referral chains, repeated failure to enforce anti-bias protocols beyond onboarding day, internal scoring models that flagged passengers for priority courtesy level using zip codes and surnames. Elena had seen the algorithm. She'd watched it assign less attentive service to high-risk profiles, codes that disproportionately flagged Black, Latino, and Asian passengers. It wasn't overt. It was just coded. When bias is data-driven, it hides behind math. But she had followed the pattern. And now the airline's entire facade was burning beneath that fluorescent light. Elena slid the audit file across the table. In accordance with federal compliance expectations and AdverLink standards, she said, the pending $3.8 billion merger will be suspended. The Grand Sky rep inhaled sharply. Suspended? Indefinitely, Elena replied. The head of security looked up. Is there a chance to reverse this? There's a chance, Elena said, but it requires more than PR. It requires soul surgery. Kelly opened her mouth to object, but no words came out. Elena stood. She adjusted her blazer, picked up her envelope, and said quietly, I wasn't removed from first class. I was placed exactly where I needed to be, to see who still believes power wears a suit and bias hides in silence. As she left the room, the wall seemed to shrink, because it wasn't just Grand Sky that had failed. It was every executive who had ever thought dignity could be profiled, every system that wrapped prejudice in protocol, every leader who assumed someone didn't look the part based on shoes instead of substance. Back at AdverLink HQ, a red alert pulsed through the boardroom dashboard. Grand Sky Airlines, ethics review failed, merger status suspended, leadership score, critical condition. And with that, the system that had once dared to question Elena Moore's presence was now questioning its own survival. The fallout began not with shouting, but with whispers. Inside Grand Sky's HR department, a junior staffer named Maya Thomas sat frozen at her desk, reading the incident report that had just come across her encrypted inbox. It was stamped, confidential, executive eyes only. But her clearance was high enough to see it. She recognized the name, Elena Moore. And suddenly, every moment from the past week clicked into place. The subtle shift in internal email protocols, the urgent late-night data pulls, the unexplained visit by a corporate auditor no one was allowed to speak to. Maya had seen injustice play out before. Quietly, routinely. She had watched Black employees passed over for promotions despite stellar reviews. She had seen Hispanic flight attendants transferred to economy service zones after being told they were too informal. She had seen the look pass between executives when someone walked into a room who didn't fit the image. But until now, she'd never had proof that anyone truly saw it all. Elena had. And she didn't just see it. She documented it, systematically, silently. That changed everything. Maya stared at her reflection in the dark monitor screen. Her own silence now felt unbearable, because now she realized she was a witness. And this time, she would not let the moment pass. She drafted a message, not dramatic, not inflammatory, just the truth. This is Maya from Internal Compliance. In light of the Moore audit findings, I'm submitting a full report of witnessed bias patterns within leadership hiring over the past 12 months. I am requesting immediate third-party oversight and offering myself as a primary source. She hit send. Elsewhere, others felt the same shift. An anonymous flight attendant submitted a testimonial about being instructed to steer clear of non-VIP qualifiers when offering pre-boarding amenities, an instruction they now saw clearly for what it was. A tech specialist on the back end of Grand Sky's AI customer scoring algorithm raised a red flag about how preference mapping was subtly penalizing certain surnames and cities. A retired supervisor, long out of the loop, contacted the FAA directly to report a 2019 internal meeting where discriminatory client filtering was proposed. Off the record, of course, and just like that, the silence broke. One story became five, five became 50. By the end of the week, a protected whistleblower forum, coded Project Clear, was launched by an independent watchdog group at Adverlink's request. Hundreds of testimonies poured in, each one forming a mosaic of a culture designed not to exclude by accident, but to preserve exclusion by routine. But something else happened too. People began to transform. The young employee at the boarding gate who had tried to escort Elena away now sat quietly in the back of a company debrief, raising their hand at the end. "I was told to trust the hierarchy," they said, "but I think I just followed bias disguised as protocol. I want to be retrained, properly, not just for show." Trina West, a mid-level manager in customer service, requested to lead Grand Sky's first internal equity review team. "I was silent when I saw it happen to others," she wrote in her proposal, "and now that I know someone else had the courage to act, I won't waste that chance." Even a few passengers who had witnessed the incident from afar began sharing their versions online. "I was there at Cleargate. I saw them pull her aside. I didn't say anything. I regret that. But now I know better." The story spread, not as a scandal, but as a mirror. And mirrors once held up are hard to ignore. One by one, those who had once averted their gaze now returned it, to their own behavior, their complicity, their silence. Kelly Wexler's cousin Patricia, once the queen of passive-aggressive gatekeeping, was suspended pending review. No more monitors, no more private snacks while others suffered. Just a chair in a room facing investigators who had read everything. And Elena? She stayed silent through it all. She gave no press conferences, declined interviews, rejected accolades. Her only public appearance came in the form of a short statement, posted not on any news outlet but on the internal Grand Sky employee board. "Justice doesn't require applause, it requires memory. And the courage to break your own silence." Maya printed it, taped it beside her desk. And when younger employees walked past, she pointed to it and said, "Remember this, the system won't change because someone else sees it. It changes when you decide to see it, and say so." The witnesses had awoken, and this time they were not just watching. They were building something better from the ashes. By the end of the second week, Grand Sky Airlines was no longer running on jet fuel. It was running on damage control, emergency meetings, crisis PR briefings, legal consultations. Every department was on edge. Emails were now being written as if each word might appear in court. Slack channels fell eerily silent. Senior executives, once boisterous in quarterly calls, now whispered behind closed doors or took sudden medical leave. But the real storm wasn't coming from the top. It was rising from within. Inside an empty conference room converted into a war room, Maya Thomas sat surrounded by cardboard boxes, hard drives, and stacks of confidential reports. She wasn't alone. A small team had formed, unofficial at first, but now formally sanctioned by Adverlink's ethics division. They were known simply as the Recoders. Their mission: identify, dismantle, and redesign the structures inside Grand Sky that enabled racial bias to operate without resistance. It started with a spreadsheet, a raw, unfiltered dump of internal metrics, promotion rates, customer complaints, service recovery compensation levels, and more. The patterns were undeniable. Customers with non-traditional names were 43% more likely to be flagged for verification. Black passengers were offered fewer service recovery benefits after delays. Flight attendants from marginalized groups were disproportionately placed on less desirable routes. It wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was a blueprint, an invisible system of inequity maintained not through explicit policy, but through selective enforcement and unchecked habits. Elena had lit the match. Now the Recoders were feeding the flame. With data, they began contacting former employees, asking for patterns, policies, and stories. The more they gathered, the clearer the picture became. But not everyone welcomed the gathering storm. Grand Sky's CEO, Robert Carrington, released a video statement. In it, he acknowledged the unfortunate incident involving Ms. Moore, but quickly pivoted to celebrate our decades of commitment to inclusion. He ended with a line that landed like plastic on fire. Diversity is in our DNA. The comments section exploded because now the public knew, and no branding campaign could stop what had been set in motion. Customers began digging through their own experiences. Stories surfaced online under hashtags like number checked while black and number gatekeeping in the sky. Employees from other airlines began sharing their own truths. And other companies? They were watching Grand Sky unravel and wondering who would be next. Meanwhile, inside the war room, a whiteboard now bore a title in red ink: The Shadow Policies. Discretionary passenger reassignment, tier-based courtesy thresholds, pre-boarding profiling notes, referral-based promotion loops, image consistency staffing mandates. None of these were written in any handbook, but they lived in emails, Slack messages, whispered norms. Maya stood at the board and said, "We're going to kill these, one by one, in public, with proof." One of her teammates, Jonas, an IT compliance lead, looked up. "How public?" Maya turned the screen to face him, a live interface being built with AdverLink's full support. The transparency dashboard. It would display every complaint, audit report, and reform initiative in real time. No redactions, no spin. And once it launched, every Grand Sky customer, employee, and regulator would have full access. "Public enough?" she asked. Jonas nodded. "That'll do it." Across the country, new alliances formed. Civil rights groups, aviation watchdogs, and inclusion advocates began hosting online panels. Designing equity in closed systems, when the brand is a lie and flight and fight, power in the skies. Elena's name was rarely mentioned, but her impact pulsed through every conversation. In response to the pressure, Grand Sky's board finally relented and invited AdverLink to assign a special ethics officer to work side by side with internal leadership. They expected a consultant. They got Elena Moore. She arrived unannounced, no press, no entourage, just a single folder marked Phase 2. Inside it, a full structural overhaul proposal, independent ombudsman access for all staff, anonymous equity scoring on every customer interaction, bias response training every 6 months, real consequences for leadership misconduct, a new code of conduct that emphasized impact over intention. Robert Carrington tried to protest. "This level of transparency is untenable," he muttered. Elena didn't blink. "If truth is dangerous to your business model," she replied, "then the model's the problem." He didn't argue again. Back in the field, Kelly Wexler was reassigned to a low-traffic regional route. No first class, no influence. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement, standard practice, but it didn't shield her from the internal feedback forms submitted by her new team. Condescending, dismissive, unwilling to acknowledge harm. She lasted 3 weeks before quietly resigning. As the recoders pushed forward, Grand Sky's image continued to fracture. But something more important began to take shape beneath the ruins. A new system, designed not for optics but for operation, built not by the most powerful but by the most observant, and led not by those with loud voices, but by those who once sat in silence, learning how the storm was built, so they could unbuild it. Elena Moore had never sought a stage, but now one was built for her. At the insistence of AdverLink and public stakeholders, Grand Sky's executive board was required to hold a live internal hearing, closed to media, but open to all employees via livestream. Its purpose? To address the findings of Audit 998-X and determine the future of the airline's merger eligibility. It was held in a sterile auditorium at Grand Sky's headquarters. No branding banners, no catered refreshments, just folding chairs, a live feed, and a thick silence. Elena walked in quietly, wearing the same kind of understated outfit that had once gotten her profiled: gray blazer, flat shoes, no makeup. She carried no briefcase, just a white envelope. The board sat elevated on a platform, trying their best to appear unfazed. CEO Robert Carrington was there, flanked by legal counsel and corporate affairs officers. His eyes met Elena's, then immediately looked past her. The chair called the session to order. "Ms. Moore, this is your time to present the final review and recommendations. You'll have the floor uninterrupted." She nodded once, then walked to the center of the room. When she spoke, it wasn't with volume. It was with precision. "I've spent the past 90 days embedded in your airline's infrastructure," she began. "Not as a public face, not as a threat, but as a mirror." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. "What I found was not one incident, not one bad day. What I found was a system built on patterned exclusion, sustained by plausible deniability, and masked with PR language so elegant it became weaponized." She held up the envelope. Inside were printed screenshots, flight logs, testimony excerpts. Then she spoke each one aloud. A black pilot reassigned to cargo after filing a bias complaint. A Latina customer profiled as potential fraud risk for buying a same-day first-class ticket. A gay flight attendant written up for unprofessional tone after addressing a white passenger's misconduct. None of them headline-worthy alone. Together, they formed a chorus. When she finished, she placed the papers on the table and looked up. "This airline does not have a PR crisis. It has a moral collapse." Robert Carrington spoke next, his voice measured. "Ms. Moore, no one is denying the importance of equity, but some of your conclusions lack context. We have made strides." She interrupted for the first and only time. "Strides made in silence don't outrun harm done in public." He bristled. "We've issued apologies." "Apologies," she said. "Don't restructure systems." The room stilled, but Elena wasn't finished. "I understand your discomfort. You were trained to believe equity is a threat to efficiency, that bias is unintentional, that progress can be managed instead of embodied." She let that sit, then delivered the blow. "Effective immediately, Adverlink has frozen your $3.8 billion merger eligibility. It will not be reconsidered unless the following conditions are met." She turned to a large screen behind her. 4 points appeared. Executive leadership review, including potential removal of those implicated in obstructive or discriminatory conduct. Full internal retraining, designed and led by external experts with biannual recertification. Permanent transparency dashboard displaying complaints, resolutions, and bias audits in real time. Customer Civil Rights Oversight Committee with independent veto power over internal policy changes. Gasps echoed in the room. These weren't suggestions. They were ultimatums. Robert leaned in, voice cold. "And if we decline..." Elena didn't blink. "You'll still exist, but not under the Grand Sky name. You'll dissolve as a brand, get swallowed by competitors, and be remembered not for innovation, but for being the airline that could have redefined integrity and chose comfort instead." Someone from the back clapped once, then stopped, but the sound lingered. Because in that moment, everyone watching, online or in the room, knew that the confrontation wasn't just about Elena, it was about what happened next. The board requested a 5-minute recess. They returned in 15. The chair cleared his throat. "After conferring, the board has voted to accept all 4 conditions. Implementation begins immediately." No applause, no cheers, just collective exhale. Elena nodded, gathered her envelope, and stepped down. But as she reached the auditorium exit, a voice called out, "Ms. Moore." It was Robert. He stood awkward, trying to reclaim some dignity. "I hope you know, we didn't mean for things to go this way." She turned back slowly. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." Then she walked out. Not as an employee, not even as a whistleblower, but as someone who had confronted a monolith and moved it. And the real turbulence was only just beginning. The first to fall was the illusion. For years, Grand Sky Airlines had boasted of diversity, equity, and global vision, phrases that now rang hollow beneath the weight of Elena's revelations. The transparency dashboard went live within 72 hours of the hearing, and the numbers were damning. In the first week alone, over 1,200 unresolved customer complaints surfaced. 312 former employees submitted bias-related incidents. 17 senior managers were linked to verified discriminatory decisions. The media seized on it. But this collapse wasn't just about headlines. It was about systems buckling under their own rot. The FAA launched a full compliance investigation. Advertisers pulled back. Brand partnerships were quietly paused. One global hotel chain terminated its lounge access partnership, citing misalignment of corporate values. And then came the bombshell. A leaked internal email revealed that CEO Robert Carrington had tried to block the transparency dashboard before it launched. The language was brutal. The last thing we need is our operational laundry aired in front of woke auditors and keyboard warriors. Within an hour of the leak, he was placed on indefinite administrative leave. Within 24 hours, he resigned. The board named an interim CEO, Dr. Valerie Jordan, a former civil rights attorney turned corporate reform strategist. Her appointment was both symbolic and strategic. She had no ties to the airline's past and no tolerance for legacy excuses. Her first act? Firing Patricia Wexler, not quietly. A formal statement read, "We will not allow anyone who weaponized their authority to humiliate others to retain influence within this organization." Photos circulated online of Patricia clearing out her desk. Gone was the tailored suit. Gone were the thin-lipped smirks. In their place, a faded employee badge and a gaze too low to meet the camera. The collapse reached the cabin next. Flight attendants began speaking out. Stories of silent quotas, unofficial, VIP aesthetic guidelines, and service scripting designed to cater to appearance-based assumptions poured in. An anonymous collective of 143 flight crew members published a letter. "We were trained to smile but not to see, to accommodate but not to ask why." That ends now. The FAA responded by issuing an industry-wide audit advisory. Every major airline was now under review. Meanwhile, Adverlink's ethics team continued to dismantle the core algorithms inside Grand Sky. The AI-based service priority scoring system, once touted as cutting-edge efficiency, was found to have deeply embedded socioeconomic and racial biases. One line of code in particular drew national attention. Non-preferred, it turned out, was a euphemism for low-income, Black and brown communities. The code was traced back to a 2017 initiative labeled Customer Flow Optimization. The entire dev team behind it was disbanded. Class action lawsuits followed. Corporate sponsors panicked. One of the airline's luxury partners, a watch company whose ads ran exclusively in Grand Sky's first-class lounges, pulled out with a scathing statement, "Luxury is not built on exclusion. We will not be part of a brand that forgot that." Stock prices fell 28% in 4 days. But for Elena, the collapse was never about financial consequence. It was about truth and whether it would finally be heard. And in cities across the country, it was. A passenger in Atlanta who had been profiled for trying to fly first class with her autistic son shared her story publicly. A Nigerian-born business consultant in New York shared how Grand Sky once denied him lounge access despite platinum membership, only to offer it seconds later to the white man behind him. The collapse spread not as a scandal, but as a reckoning. Grand Sky's competitors tried to capitalize, but many had similar shadows. The conversation shifted from what happened to Grand Sky to what's hiding in our own boarding zones. Meanwhile, Elena stayed out of the spotlight. She returned to Adverlink quietly, declining interviews, refusing awards. But her legacy moved without her. Universities used Audit 998X as a case study in ethical reform. Government committees cited it while drafting new anti-discrimination policy recommendations for the Department of Transportation. And one airport, Cleargate itself, renamed its internal training program, the More Standard. Back inside Grand Sky, Dr. Jordan initiated something no airline had done before: passenger truth reports. Each quarter, a rotating panel of frequent flyers from diverse backgrounds would audit first-hand customer experience, submitting direct feedback with the power to enact change. Elena received an invitation to be the first guest speaker. She didn't reply. Instead, she sent one sentence, "Let your actions speak. I've done enough talking." By month's end, over 20 executives had stepped down or been replaced. The airline's culture hadn't just cracked, it had collapsed. But from that rubble, something else began to rise. The building didn't change. The gates still bore the Grand Sky name. The planes still lifted off from runways across the country. But inside the walls, inside the culture, the airline was no longer the same. The rebirth began quietly. Not with ads, not with rebranding campaigns, but with confrontation from within. Dr. Valerie Jordan didn't issue empty promises. She issued policies and results. Her leadership philosophy was simple. Transparency isn't optional. It's the air we breathe. The first reform was structural. The executive suite was completely reconstituted. Half of all C-level roles were filled with external leaders from ethics, community development, and behavioral design, not legacy aviation. Eleanor Moore was offered the chief compliance officer role. She declined. Instead, she nominated someone else, Maya Thomas, the whistleblower from within. "I've done the auditing," Elena said. "Now it's time for someone who survived the system to rebuild it." Maya accepted reluctantly. But on her first day, she didn't enter with a keynote or a press release. She walked the terminal, sat in gate waiting areas, ate in the staff cafeteria. Her first official act wasn't to sign a document, it was to listen. And she heard everything. A ticketing agent who had been taught to suggest alternatives to passengers who looked anxious. A regional manager who quietly swapped names on promotion lists after reputation feedback from white frequent flyers. A hiring coordinator who admitted she used to filter resumes based on the presence of difficult-to-pronounce names. Maya didn't react with outrage. She documented. Then she began to rewrite everything. Every performance review process, every complaint routing structure, every data model used to flag preferred behavior. All of it was ripped up and rebuilt. New hires went through empathy integration training, designed with trauma psychologists and sociolinguists. AI tools were rebuilt under open-source supervision, their code audited line by third parties. Flight crews were rotated across cabins to break the unspoken class segregation between economy and first. And most dramatically, every Grand Sky staff member was required to complete the perspective exchange, a program where executives shadowed gate agents flew as passengers, and passengers were invited to boardroom feedback panels. It wasn't a campaign. It was a curriculum. 6 months after the collapse, internal morale had rebounded to historic highs. Customer trust, once shattered, began to return. The transparency dashboard, once seen as punitive, became a badge of honor. Other airlines began requesting access to its blueprint. Dr. Jordan made it public. "If we truly believe equity is the future of this industry, we don't compete on who does it best," she said. "We share the map." Meanwhile, former employees who had been driven out, like Andre, the consultant unjustly terminated from the West Coast hub, were invited back. But not just for jobs, for justice. Andre became director of organizational healing, a new department tasked with helping staff navigate the emotional reckoning of working inside a broken system. His first act was to implement reflection rooms, physical spaces in each terminal where staff and passengers alike could decompress, report mistreatment, or simply breathe without judgment. These weren't luxuries. They were interruptions designed to halt the momentum of habitual harm. Not everyone embraced the change. Some legacy managers resigned. A few longtime flight attendants balked at the new service models, calling them coddling. But for every exit, 10 new candidates applied, eager to work for an airline that no longer ran on performance alone, but on principle. In one powerful shift, Grand Sky ended its long-standing practice of separating first-class lounges by terminal. Instead, they launched Sky Commons, inclusive spaces open to all passengers based on travel stress factors, not ticket class. Families, elderly travelers, people with medical conditions, and solo flyers were prioritized, not based on money but on need. For the first time, people saw themselves reflected in every tier of the company, from the maintenance team to the boardroom. Passengers began writing thank you letters. One said, "I flew Grand Sky last year and left humiliated. This year I left hopeful. I don't know what changed, but I felt it. Thank you." That letter was posted on every staff bulletin board, not as proof of success, but as a reminder. Elena Moore didn't attend the staff summit where the 6-month transformation was unveiled, but she sent a single message to Maya. "This wasn't your reward, it's your responsibility. Keep building." Maya read it out loud before concluding the summit with her only prepared statement. "Rebuilding a system doesn't begin with belief. It begins with behavior. We may not undo the past, but we control the blueprint of what comes next. And this time, it won't be built on silence. The room stood in ovation, not for Maya, not for grand sky, but for what it meant that a company could burn and still rise, not by erasing its sins, but by transforming them into stone and using them to build a stronger foundation. There are stories that end with applause, with headlines, with awards and closing speeches. But the story of Elena Moore did not end that way, because it was never about her. Her name never appeared on any billboard. She accepted no spotlight, refused every TV interview, and declined even the White House invitation to speak on equity in corporate systems. "Let others speak," she wrote back. "I've already been heard where it mattered." And that was true, because the silence that had once tried to erase her now carried her legacy in 1,000 voices, not echoing her words, but building upon her actions. Across the airline industry, ripple effects became policy. 3 regional airlines rewrote their internal onboarding systems, citing Grand Sky's reforms as a catalyst. One major airport partnered with local communities to launch inclusive hiring programs, intentionally recruiting from neighborhoods historically excluded from the aviation workforce. But perhaps the most powerful shift came not from corporations, but from individuals. A gate agent at JFK, who once quietly watched a black woman get questioned without cause, now made it her mission to speak up, every time. A teenage intern who once thought he was too invisible to matter, now helped develop AI bias filters as part of a university partnership inspired by the AdverLink reforms. And Maya Thomas? She became more than just chief compliance officer. She became a symbol of second chances with purpose. She hosted Grand Sky's first internal storytelling summit, where frontline workers shared experiences once hidden behind policy walls. From those sessions came a new company value. Power is not control. Power is accountability. And there, in a room full of voices that had once been silenced, something became clear. This wasn't just an airline anymore. It was a living system, a memory, a lesson, a commitment. At Cleargate Airport, a new plaque was mounted quietly near Gate 7. It bore no names, just a quote. "Sometimes justice doesn't raise its voice, it simply refuses to move." Passengers passed it every day. Most didn't notice, but those who had lived the story did. They saw it and they remembered. Elena Moore had taught the industry a new kind of reckoning, one that didn't come through lawsuits or headlines, but through structure, strategy, and a refusal to accept invisibility as status quo. Her legacy was not in vengeance, it was in design. She didn't dismantle the system out of anger, she rewired it out of clarity, because she knew something too many forget. Justice isn't only about setting the record straight, it's about setting the standard forward. And when she stood silently in that priority lane, clutching a phone instead of a podium, she wasn't just recording injustice. She was activating reform, not with noise, but with nerve, not with protest signs, but with protocol rewrites, not to be remembered, but to ensure the next person in line wouldn't be forgotten. Months later, at a private cafe tucked into a quiet Seattle neighborhood, Elena sat alone, sipping coffee and reading a paperback. No press, no escort, no one recognized her. Except one. A young girl, maybe 14, approached nervously. "Ms. Moore?" Elena looked up. "I read about you at school," the girl said. "They said you made a company change everything." Elena smiled. "It wasn't just me." "I want to do that too," the girl said. "Make things better. For people." "You already have," Elena said gently, "by saying that out loud." The girl beamed, then hurried back to her family. And in that moment, Elena knew the real legacy wasn't what she changed, it was who would continue. Because systems break, but people rebuild. And the strongest blueprints are written not in stone, but in story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.